bright and fresh, and I hope we can carry on our story. Now, yesterday we went on a long journey, and it's going on an even longer one today. So, are we ready? Have your seatbelts on. Now, let's just review what we talked about yesterday. So let's review, as we always do in Waldorf, to really help us understand more deeply. So, let's just go a little bit over where we were yesterday. He'll be listening. He'll be listening. I'll ask him to review as well. So, now remember we talked about the two journeys that happened at the same time. And so what are the two journeys we talked about? So first of the journey is the journey that we each go on. So as we grow up, we start from early childhood and we go through a series of stages to grow into the way that we think. So we call this the story of thinking. And there is the journey that each one of us goes on in growing up to become a thinking person. And what are those stages that we go through? The first stage is playing, right? And then we go into primary school with more imagination. And then we gradually emerge. We grow into what we are as adults, where we start to think in terms of reason. We start to understand why one thing causes another. So that's a journey that we each have gone on. And then we have the big journey, which is the human journey, and the journey of humanity as a whole. And we talked about the way that in the very ancient culture, and we went back and we looked at Australia's indigenous people, the Aboriginal people, which is the oldest civilization on Earth. Goes back, the oldest that we have any evidence for. And we talked about their way of working, and if we were to think about that, you saw all those diagrams and interesting things. And so remember we talked about the way they experience the world in terms of they believe they are simply acting out the ancestors, the dreaming, and then how they organise their family life. Everyone is related to everyone else, and they have those very fixed rules where they have to, how they behave toward each other. That's the beginning. So there's no, in a sense, no debate, no freedom in that. It's all, this is laid down. And then from there, they move on. And then we went through then, we looked at some of the early cultures and the early civilizations we went through, and we looked at China, we looked at India, and then we looked at the Middle Eastern cultures, Egypt, the Middle Eastern world. Yep, good. We're in action. Thank you. All right, and then we got right up to a particular, what we call a turning point. And remember the turning point was in, where was that? In ancient Greece. That's right. So that was the turning point. And what was the big difference that the ancient Greeks, something happened there that was different from what had happened with all those earlier cultures. All those earlier cultures.
Thinking for themselves.
They're starting to think for themselves. That's right. And so I went back, well I won't go back and show it to you again, but we talked about the way that all the earlier cultures, people felt that their lives were living out what the gods or what the creative powers had laid down in the beginning. And that behind nature there were these creative spiritual powers of the gods. But then something starts to happen, and in ancient Greece, people start to ask questions in a new way. And this is something that is quite unique, something that does seem to have happened just in this one place, particularly. And we talked about people like Socrates and Plato, and then this particular individual called Aristotle, he's often said to be the first scientist. And if you think about how today our whole world now is based around science, and the modern world is based around science, and everyone thinks now, like every educated person now, thinks a little bit like a scientist, because we have to, think about how the world works and how things work. We think like a scientist. He's the first one. So he's the first one who really starts to say, well, what lives in the world? How does the world work? And it's the beginning of reason in this format, the modern format. Even though it's ancient Greece, it's actually modern in this sense. It's the beginning of the modern world, even though it's 2,000 years old. And so from there, things start to build up. And we talked about then, there was one other important thing that we talked about with Greece, and that was how they governed themselves. And do you remember the phrase, the words they used to describe how they governed themselves? Remember, they didn't use kings. Their kings kind of did bad things, and when their king, the last king, died without anyone following, they said, let's not have a king. And they organised themselves in a new way. Do you remember what they called it? There was a special word. Demos Kriton. Yeah, very close. Demos Kriton. It's Greek and it means the people speak. And the people all worked together. So this was a new thing, Demos Kriton. And it came at the same time as this new kind of thinking. This new way of thinking that said, let's look at how the world works. How one thing causes another. Before then, it was more, the gods will tell us how the world works. And even the great, massive monuments that were built in ancient Egypt, the massive things that were built in India and in China, all those things were still built out of this sense of the gods will tell us how to live. Now, for the first time in ancient Greece, this little place, people start to think and to say, how does the world work? How does one thing cause another? And then how can we manage the world ourselves? Now keep this in mind, because this, of course, is how we live really today in the modern world. But it just first starts off in ancient Greece. And then, of course, lots of things happen after that. We heard about Alexander the Great. And now we're up to ancient Rome. And ancient Rome builds on this. And we went back and we looked at some of the things that they did. Going back here, this is we looked at the massive, this great Roman Empire that was stretched right across the Mediterranean. Biggest empire of the world at that time. And then we looked at the monuments that they built. They have fantastic engineering. They built buildings which are still standing today. All these things. And then we heard about and how they would really protected their republic. They were the first ones they called their way of working a republic. And a republic meant we don't have a king. We're able to live ourselves without a king. But then remember, we heard the story of famous story of one man who was a general who was so good, they were worried that he might become a king. And they were so worried that he was actually murdered. He was actually killed. But then out of that emerged an even bigger king. This goes to show sometimes things don't work out. And this was Augustus. He was the first emperor. And after the fighting that happened after Julius Caesar was killed, there was these wars, and he emerged as the one who was the main guy, we would say. And he became the emperor, and he really now establishes Rome as this big empire. Now, that's the story so far, and they're starting to work with this new way of thinking, and the Romans take it to another level, and all the people live with this new idea. but all ruled by now an emperor. Now something happens, something new comes into, over the next few hundred years, two new things come into the world, which didn't exist before. The first one happens over in what the Hebrew lands of Palestine. And this is the beginnings of the Christian story. Now it's an interesting story because this emperor, he had such a big empire, he wanted to know how big it was. He didn't know. He wanted to know how many people he ruled. And so he said, well, how am I going to find out how many people there are in my empire? So he decided to count them. What a simple idea. He said, I'll count them. But then how am I going to count all these millions of people? So he told everyone they had to go back to their hometown. Everyone had to go back to their hometown. And if you went back to your hometown, you will count up everyone in your hometown. Now that was a big order. Now it was the first time this had ever been done in history. No one had ever done this before. And we call it now a census. You all know what a census is when one night they count everyone who's in the country. Every 5 years, I don't know how often you do it in Malaysia, we do it in Australia, every 5 years they count everyone. Put your hand up if you're here, and so everyone gets counted. But this was the first one. They'd never done one before. And Caesar Augustus sends out a decree saying everyone has to go back to their hometown. So everyone does. Now over in these Hebrew lands, there's this man called Joseph. And he says he has to go back to his hometown. And his hometown happens to be Bethlehem. And this starts, of course, the whole Christian story, because there his wife is about to have a baby. They go back to Bethlehem because of this decree from Caesar Augustus. And there she gives birth to Jesus. And there that starts the whole story of the Christian story. And Jesus goes through his life in the Hebrew world, there to the Jewish people. He then goes through these crucified, killed by the Jewish elders, and then he resurrected. And then that begins the whole story of the Christian church. But it starts off as a group of Jewish people until one man goes through a particular conversion, and this is St. Paul. And St. Paul is he's a Jewish man, and he has an experience of the risen Christ, he says. And he then is so enthused with this, he takes this out to the wider world. And he takes the beginnings of this Christian story from being just a story among the Jewish people. He then takes it out to all the other people who lived in that area. He goes out to what they call the Gentiles. And he speaks Greek, which is the language of all those areas, and he travels all over the Roman Empire. And he's a quite remarkable person, very, very, very smart. And he tells the story, and so Christianity then emerges as a whole new force. And it spreads right through Rome. Now, at the same time, of course, there is something else happens within just a few hundred years later. And while the Roman Empire is now building and it becomes a Christian empire, of course, over in the Middle East, a whole new development starts. Muhammad has his revelation, and with his revelation, now a whole new empire begins. And this is the next stage in our consciousness, where these two great forces now are, we say, contending. And this leads to the rise of a whole new world, a whole new empire in the Middle East. As you know, the world of Harun al-Rashid and the Islamic Golden Age. So after the Roman Golden Age, there is now a new Golden Age, which is that of, based in Baghdad and Damascus, and the Islamic Golden Age becomes a a huge empire in itself. And very quickly, Islam spreads across both the Middle East, North Africa, even right into parts of Europe. And over in Baghdad, Damascus, there becomes this whole new centre of learning. And these great individuals, like the Renaissance of the Middle Eastern world, now emerges. And you have great scholars, researchers like Avicenna, and the great literature that emerges in the Islamic Golden Age, and where they're studying, and this leads to a whole flowering of things. Now, what's most interesting is that this Golden Age is based on so many of the texts and the learning that had come from the Greeks. So the ancient Greeks, Aristotle, they had done all this scientific work and scientific research, and they had written these down. And remember, we talked of Alexander the Great. He went on his great journey and he took all of these Greek books and manuscripts over to the Middle East. And there they were translated into Arabic. And then all of that learning then becomes part of this Islamic Golden Age. They work on all these texts, all the philosophy, the mathematics in particular, some of even the medicine. They work on this in this Islamic Golden Age, and they work on this and they develop it to a new level. And this leads to the Islamic Empire, which stretches across a very large swathe of the Middle Eastern world. So the Roman Empire had been more on the top, along here. And before that, Alexander had gone from here across here. Now this becomes the Islamic Empire, which stretches right across there. But all of this wisdom that the Greeks had developed now lives in the Arab world. And it lives there, while at the same time, Europe at this time, by this stage now, of course, the Roman Empire had fallen. And the Islamic age built up. Now, after a few hundred years, Europe kind of recovers. Rome was invaded by all these, the Genghis Khan and various other people from the east had come and had invaded. But over time, a few hundred years later, they recover. And a new Christian empire now emerges in Europe, which is led by Charlemagne, called Charles I. The great Charles, which in the French was Charlemagne. So Charlemagne is the trying not to write too many titles, but this is Charlemagne just means Charles, the great Charles. Now, so then you have these two great empires, in a sense, vying for position. And that leads to the great conflict that is we call the Crusades, where when the Christian kingdoms of Europe became stronger, they wanted to go back and claim what they called the Holy Land for themselves. And this leads to the Crusades, where there is the battle. Now, what's interesting about the Crusades is it's a war, but even when there is a war, it's a strange thing. It actually brings people together. It's a strange thing. Even though they're fighting, they have to come together. So what it does is it actually brings the Europeans back into contact with the Middle East. And many of those who were in the fighting, the Crusaders, these knights and soldiers who came from Europe, they sail across the Mediterranean and they're engaged in these great battles. And they were there for a long time. They built big castles. And most importantly, they had to meet and actually interact with the Arabic people who were there. And here they find these Arabic texts that had all the old Greek philosophy and Greek wisdom. And they're amazed by these, they're amazed by the learning that they find in the Islamic Empire. And they actually bring these, when they return, many of the Crusaders, when they return, they take with them the things they've learned from the Arab people, the Arab scholars. And all that Greek learning that had actually been lost during the Roman times, it comes back from the Arabic world. And they bring it back to Europe. So there's this long kind of train, this journey, all this wisdom and learning that the Greeks developed, that Aristotle, that even Aristotle's writings that he'd written in Greek were translated into Arabic, and then they got translated back into Latin so that he could be read in Europe. So it's this long journey through all these strange byways. So the Crusades are the extraordinary time where these terrible battles that went on, with these massive fighting and shocking fighting. In the end, of course, the Arabs win. Saladin, who's the great leader of the Sultan who leads the Arab forces, he defeats finally the Crusaders. They retreat back to Europe, but they take with them this learning from the Greeks. So it's gone from the Greeks to the Arabs back to Europe, kind of in these strange ways. And there they bring this back, and this leads to the flowering of what we call the Middle Ages, the medieval world in Europe. And of course it inspires so many remarkable new developments. And this is the Middle Ages. And this Middle Ages has this new consciousness. In Europe it's based on the Christian church, but it's inspired remarkably by the Arabs and in turn by the Greeks. And so many of the things which are classic in the medieval European world, one of the most fundamental things, one of the most fundamental designs, in their Gothic cathedrals, some of the arches in the Gothic cathedrals, the way they designed them actually came from the Arab world. So it actually, there's this constant stream, even though they appear to be separate, they're actually inspiring each other. And this leads to this great world very beautiful world of medieval Europe. Medieval Europe sort of builds up its sort of strength, and it spends 200-300 years consolidating all of this that's gone before. So it takes it's based on the Christian church, but it's also based on the Arabic wisdom and on the Greek wisdom. So all of this together. So even though it's in Europe, it's actually taking in all of this wisdom together. And the great philosopher of the Middle Ages is called Thomas Aquinas. And Thomas Aquinas, his great role was to bring together the new Christian impulse with all the Greek impulse before it. So he brings all of this together. He was one of the great geniuses, and he brings all this together in a series of great books that puts all of this philosophy together. So as you see, as things have moved on, everything is coming together. So it's all of the Greek wisdom, which he's joined with some of the Arabic wisdom and with the Christian wisdom. And all of this builds this Middle Ages, the medieval world of Europe. And there's, lots of details, but this is the key essence. And so this consolidates it. And the Middle Ages in Europe is like a time of bringing all this together and getting stronger and stronger before something new breaks out. And we call it the real time of the intellectual age. In Rudolf Steiner's words, we call it the intellectual soul, because people like Aquinas, they really totally understand everything through their intellect. Now this lays it's like the platform for then what comes over the next few hundred years, which leads to all of us. And this is our modern world. This is the basic platform on which the modern world that we're all part of, where it all comes from. Because after this, there now starts something new. Some new impulse now comes out. And this is what we call the Renaissance, which is the birth of something new. The Renaissance is the birth of a whole new way of thinking, which is like a breaking out from the Middle Ages and a step forward into really a new consciousness. And it's led by people such as Leonardo da Vinci. And it's a new way of thinking. And it's built on what was before, and every step obviously builds on what went before. You know, we're all like a staircase where we go up a series of stairs. Each step we go a little bit higher, or a new step. And people like Leonardo represent this new consciousness where they're wanting to understand the world in a new way. Now they look back to the old Greek ideas, but they also take it in a new way. And Renaissance, the word Renaissance, that you all know, it actually means birth. It's from the French word it means a rebirth, like a rebirth of the old. But the Renaissance is really a new birth. I think there's something new because it really leads to a new way of thinking. And what now happens over the next 500 years is a gradual step. Every step on the way is something new unfolding. And so people like Leonardo, his great paintings, his great works, Raphael, these great people who do these things, Michelangelo with their sculpture, all of these remarkable and extraordinary artistic works that we still look back to, that right now there will be thousands of people queuing up to see this statue in Italy. Right now, every single day of the year, we know. So even now, these things that have inspired everyone so much, these great sculptures. And so it's really a special time, and it happens in this one place, in Italy. This is where it starts. As I said, everything has to start somewhere, and then it spreads. And this whole new way of thinking. And from there, the Renaissance is this artistic outpouring, but behind it is a new way of thinking. And the new way of thinking, that's more Michelangelo. And in England, but the Renaissance has more. In Italy, the Renaissance is one of artworks, painting, sculpture. In different countries, it's different things. In Germany, it's more music, and in England, it's more theatre, where Shakespeare he's the kind of what we call the English Renaissance. And this leads to, it's a breaking up, it's a freeing up after the very tight world of the Middle Ages. After this very tight world, the Renaissance represents this new breakthrough. And of course it leads most importantly to a new way of thinking. And this is a way of thinking that's hard to put one's finger on, but it's where all of these things start to now emerge in a new form. And in Europe we call it the Enlightenment. Now it's a word that simply means we're now going to think for ourselves, rather than just thinking what the gods have thought, or even what the church has thought. We're now going to think for ourselves. And one of the key figures is the French mathematician René Descartes, and he's the one who says the famous statement, "I think, therefore I am." I think, therefore I am. If I can think for myself, I exist. Now that's a complex statement which we could discuss, but in essence, what it means is that it comes down to my individual impulse, my own thoughts. I will work out my own destiny. He's one of the first, and there was a series of other people who thought in a similar way. And together they represent this new way of thinking that emerges in Europe of the Enlightenment. I'm going to work out things for myself. Now, of course, this leads to lots of challenges to the kings and queens of Europe and to the way people did things. And this there ushers in now a whole series of very big changes. So this Enlightenment is the foundation of these massive changes which now start to take place in Europe. And one of the first big change is the development of machinery, the Industrial Revolution. And this now starts to happen, but it's all one step on from the Enlightenment. People now started to think, how can I make machines that will make human labour, that will do things instead of people? You all know the famous story of the man, James Watt, sitting watching his kettle boiling on his fire. He was this Englishman, he was a very clever man, he could sort of make things, and he was sitting watching, he was sitting in his home, and he had the fire on, and he had a kettle on the fire, and the kettle had a lid on the top. And as he watched the steam in the boiling water, he's noticed the lid starting to go up and down. And he thought, gee, that's pretty clever. The steam is pushing the lid. He thought, gosh, if we could use the steam, we could make things move. So of course, he takes that idea, he starts playing around with pistons, piston where pressure pushes something up, and the pistons that can turn things around. And he starts to invent the first engine, the steam engine, where you have boiling water, the steam pushes things up and down, and then if you just need something to turn that, connect that to wheels, then that makes the wheels go round, and of course you have the first railway. So that becomes the beginnings of a whole new way of working. And then other people invent new machines that can do things quicker than one person could do. And those of you who have taught these stories know all the stories of how they wanted to make spinning. When they spun, they had wool. They wanted to turn it into the sheep. From the sheep, they wanted to turn it into wool that could be then woven into cloth. They worked out ways of making the spinning go around quicker without a person having to run it. And so they started inventing these machines where lots of people working together are able to produce far more than what just a family used to be able to produce. And this starts the whole Industrial Revolution. Now this is what changes the world, because this now has a massive effect on everyone. Because now instead of people living in the countryside and cities being just small places, and most people living out in the country, now they start to build factories, and people leave the country and come and live next to the factories. And this leads to the growth of big cities. And it starts, of course, in England, is the start of it. And very soon it's happening in Germany and in France and other parts of Europe. And this starts, and it then spreads around the world. But it all begins in England, in Europe. And so this transforms everything. So what it does is it takes people away from their families. If you live out in the country, all your family are living next to you. Now, if you have to go and move next to a factory, you leave all your aunts and uncles and grandparents away there, and you go and live as one family next to the factory. So you now have to, in a sense, stand on your own 2 feet as an individual, separate, small family. So this leads to a whole new way of thinking and doing. Now, the Industrial Revolution is a big story, and it just carries on. In one sense, it's never stopped. It's just spread around the world. And gradually over time, other countries now are these conditions are of course now working in many other parts of the world, many other countries. This is all now happening. The big factories in India and China where they're making all the parts for Apple iPhones and so on, they're often working in conditions like this that was started back in England back in the 1770s. And this now leads to a new push as well. Over in America, where the English had gone to set up a new colony, they start to think for themselves as well. And in America, they start to have a revolution where they decide they don't want to be ruled by the king and the queen anymore of England, and they have a revolution, and they make a declaration of independence. They have a revolution, the American Revolution. They decide they're not going to be ruled by the English anymore, and they set up their own country that is a republic that has no king. And that of course leads from the US to France. And the French have a revolution where they decide that they don't want to be ruled by kings either. Now all of this comes from the ideas of the Enlightenment. The ideas that I am an individual, that I have the right to think for myself, and that I'm not going to be ruled by a king or a queen. And the French Revolution is the beginnings of, in Europe, of this massive change, which leads to revolutions across Europe. This is a famous painting by a French painter called Liberty Leading the People. And it is and he tried to capture the spirit of this revolutionary age. And that's why we call it the Age of Revolutions. There's the Industrial Revolution, and now there are the political revolutions, where people want to do away with kings, and they want to base their way of working on their own individual rights as a person. Now the whole movement then spreads, and it spreads around the world. And even in South America, around this time, countries like, you see there's all these countries of South America that have been ruled by Spain. People like Simón Bolívar leads the revolution against the Spanish government. And of course, it spreads right around the world to this individual. Who can tell me who this is? You should recognise this as part of your history. Who is this one? Give you a hint. He's a doctor. No? Yeah. You recognise these people? This is a little story. That was Dr. Sun Yat-sen. Now over in China, is it the Qing, you pronounce it? The Qing dynasty, the last one? Qing, the Qing dynasty. The Qing dynasty. And a lot of these ideas are spreading around the world. Now these ideas have come from Europe, of spreading the idea of individual rights, individual autonomy, and the right to control your own life. And this is a picture, I found this little picture just last night actually, and it includes, these were young medical students in Hong Kong. And they were students of medicine. They were studying medicine in Hong Kong. And they had become infused with these ideas of being able to have individual rights and not being ruled by a hereditary king or queen, an empire. And these medical students, and this is Sun Yat-sen, is that how you pronounce his name? Sun Yat-sen. And he and his four friends, they were called by the government, they were called the Four Bandits, because they saw them as being disrupting the Qing dynasty. But then he goes to Europe, and there they develop a committee, they developed together a plan to overthrow the Chinese, the imperial government. this was a newspaper article in France, Sun Yat-sen and the Chinese Revolutionary Committee of Europe. So they're inspired by these European ideas of individual rights. And that leads to, of course, and you know the story is very complicated, the overthrow of the Qing dynasty, 1911, and the founding of the Republic of China. So they're inspired by these revolutionary ideas from Europe. And this leads to the democratic Chinese, it was called the Chinese Democratic Revolution. This is all the Sun Yat-sen and all the leaders of that revolution around 1911. Now, what are they drawing their inspiration from? And all these revolutionary ideas, they all took their idea when they said, what shall we call this new movement that we want? They went back to, remember this slide we had of the old Greeks? Demos Kriton, the people speak. So this new impulse, they took their name from this and they invented the word democracy. And this is where it comes from the Greeks. And it inspired all of those different people in different countries, the French, the Americans, the South Americans, Chinese. So all of those inspired from ancient Greece. Now, of course, this leads into, and all this age of revolutions, it rolls on through the 19th century. Starts off, of course, in the 18th century with the French and the Americans, then the 19th century with all those other countries. And then it rolls into the 20th century, and that's, of course, the great wars that we had of the Second World War, which convulses the whole world. And, of course, all the fighting that came out of that, you know, across the world, both in Europe and in Asia. And then finally, after the war is over, the first thing that people did when the war finishes in 1945, the governments of the world get together, and after this terrible destruction, they get together and 50 countries meet straight after the end of the Second World War, and they decide that they don't want to have any of this ever again, and they meet to form a world body they call the United Nations. And the United Nations, of course, in a sense represents the modern consciousness of working together. We could say it hasn't been terribly effective because there are many wars that have gone on, but it represents really what people, the aspirations that people have, what we want to have. And what was the first thing that when they got together, the first thing when they all got together, all the countries of the world, they wrote this very important document. And it's the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Now it's the document that really says what, as modern people, we aspire to, what we want to have. And the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is based on the idea that every person has unique rights. And this put into words what had been worked on all the way from ancient Greece, through the Romans, through the Middle Ages, through all those through the Enlightenment, through all the revolutions. It all comes together in this document, this one document, the individual rights. And the idea of democracy, meaning the two go together. Because if you have individual rights, you also have the right to vote and to determine your government. And that's how you should be governed. Not by a king telling you what to do. Of course, we still have kings and queens, but now they have become, in a sense, what we call ceremonial. They're there to represent the country. They do an important job as representing the well-being of the country, but the actual running of the government is determined by the people. And it comes together in this document, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Now that's a long journey. That journey has taken 2,000 years or more to come to that. But that's our modern consciousness. That's what we all, in a sense, what we agree on. And all the science, technology, all of these things that we have are brought from that. Something else. So it's been a long journey, and this is the long story, and it's not finished. It's an interesting story. Where's it going to go next? Is one of the big questions. But this is the journey, the long journey of humanity that's taken us from that very ancient times. And if you think back to remember that what I talked about with Aboriginal people in Australia, the earliest consciousness on earth, and how everything was laid down, everything was rules, and you had to marry someone from this group, and you had to relate to this group in that way. It was all done in groups, and all done in a sense everyone was family, everyone. So in that ancient time, everyone that you related to, everyone that you connected, everyone that you knew was family. You only knew family. And now through all this long journey, all this world is broken up, and here we are, all individuals. We're all separate. Now, even something like this gathering today here is interesting. You see, if you went back to that original consciousness of Aboriginal people there, the only people they know are family. Everyone is related to everyone else. And the rules told you how to act toward those people. Whereas now, we have our own family, but most of the people we interact with, we're not related to. Is anyone related to anyone else in this room? Anyone? No one has sisters, brothers, aunties, uncles, right? We're all separate, right? So that's the modern consciousness. We're all separate individuals. We have our own little family behind us, right? But we relate to the world separately. Right? So back in that ancient consciousness, everyone was family. Everyone was family. It's the only people you knew. Now, we're all separate individuals. We have a little family behind us, but everyone else, the rest of the world that we know, is individual. And this document, in a sense, is our new kind of statement of how we should relate to each other, with respect, with dignity, and having rights to elect our own government. Now that's the story of where we're up to, and that's the journey. So it came through democracy and human rights. This journey came through